Okay, so in the news today, it broke that apparently the government did actually plan some reforms of the Gender Recognition Act, which actually is quite I'm not sure pleasant is the right word because they never happened, but it does make me feel a little bit better in terms of my view of the government improved slightly, and that they were looking at reforms, but they were scrapped. So let's read it. So Tory Equalities Chief Liz Truss was planning proper reforms to the Gender Recognition Act, GRA, and had Boris Johnson's support, but changed her mind and scrapped reforms after input from the NHS's National Advisor for LGBT Health. So that's very interesting. The revelation is contained in evidence submitted by the Government Equalities Office, GEO, about the behind-the-scenes wrangling over GRA reform in the first half of 2020 to a judicial review at the Northern Ireland High Court into the need for medical evidence in legal gender recognition. In a written judgment from the High Court Judicial Review, it's another word I can't pronounce apparently, it has been revealed that Liz Truss was minded to remove the requirement for a gender dysphoria diagnosis from the Gender Recognition Act as of 11th of June 2020. The GRA provides a mechanism by which adult trans men and women can change their legal gender by applying for a gender recognition certificate that can be used to obtain a new birth certificate in the correct sex. Applicants must have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria to be able to prove they've lived in their acquired gender for at least 2 years and intend to live as such for the rest of their lives. 2 separate medical reports must also be obtained by applicants, one containing details of the person's gender dysphoria diagnosis, which is a psychiatric diagnosis, meaning it can't be made by a GP and has to come from a gender specialist, and one containing details of any medical transition the person has gone through or is planning. Given the lengthy waiting list for NHS gender clinics, it can take as long as 5 or 6 years to get a gender dysphoria diagnosis on NHS. Can attest to the very long waiting times. I only have one because I can afford private. The process of having to get a psychiatric diagnosis before being able to access legal gender recognition was described by human rights groups as dehumanizing and reinforced the view that trans people are mentally ill. LGBT plus groups called for this requirement to be removed from the Gender Recognition Act in the 2018 consultation. But the GEO's court documents show Truss was told that Dr. Michael Brady, National Advisor for LGBT Health, said there wasn't any stigma attached to including a gender dysphoria requirement in legal gender recognition. Okay, interesting. I'm intrigued where that came from. Dr. Brady, who is also medical director at the Terence Higgins Trust and a sexual health and HIV consultant for King's College Hospital, had earlier provided, quote, helpful insight in May 2020 that removing the diagnosis of gender dysphoria would be an impractical step. Okay, what are the reasons? I'd be interested to know as well. It has become clear from our discussions with the Department of Health and Social Care and the helpful insight provided by the National Advisor on LGBT Health, Dr. Michael Brady, that removing the diagnosis of gender dysphoria while maintaining a medical aspect to this process would be an impractical step, officials said. Well, how about we get rid of the medical aspect then? Isn't that the solution? Why does there need to be a medical aspect? The consultation showed people were in favour of removing. Okay. For those seeking medical support to change their gender, the NHS would continue to provide a diagnosis of gender dysphoria or gender incongruence, even if we remove this requirement from the GRA process. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. The view of the DHSC and NHS England officials and advisors was that such a change would create confusion and uncertainty among clinicians, and so they do not currently support such a change. Okay, so they're arguing that if you remove the requirement for gender dysphoria diagnosis in order to obtain legal recognition, then that would confuse clinicians when you're going through for medical treatment. Why? Medical treatment, and medically transitioning is different to legal recognition. So why are they confusing? Okay. Also, just to say that gender incongruence is the term that's replaced gender dysphoria in the latest WHO, the World Health Organization's guidance on trans health. It was also previously listed under what was it? You know what? We'll get to that later, and I don't want to misquote where that was. So, but it's been moved, and it's now referred to as gender incongruence. The view of the DHSC and NHS England officials and advisors was that such a change would create confusion and uncertainty among clinicians, and so they do not currently support a change. According to the High Court judgment, it was the view that the DHSC that the decision to remove the diagnosis of gender dysphoria from the GRA should be clinician-led. There was no evidence submitted to the court to suggest that the views of clinicians were considered other than Dr. Brady. Right, okay. Well, that doesn't mean there isn't any evidence, but that would have been pertinent, would it not? So, I mean, that's heartbreaking, to be honest. So they were pretty much at the point of deciding to remove the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, not admittedly removing the report, but hey, it's a good step in the right direction. But instead they decided not to because it might be slightly confusing. What? And there's no evidence to support that? Okay, so we'll come back to that. So, gender dysphoria and stigma. Documents were submitted to the court which refer to a meeting between GEO officials, DHSC officials, and Dr. Brady on the 12th of May 2020. The meeting notes, quote, Dr. Brady is saying that gender dysphoria is the accepted terminology. And, I just realised I am a Muppet. No, ignore me. Realised I put the wrong name on the stream. Anyway, the meeting notes, quote, Dr. Brady is saying that gender dysphoria is the accepted terminology, although there is a move towards gender incongruence, and adds that he has not been advised by trans people that a diagnosis or label was stigmatising, but felt the process overall was stigmatising and that the issue of stigma should be seen in that context. In May 2019, the World Health Organization stopped classifying being trans as a disorder by moving from a diagnosis of gender identity disorder under its mental health disorders chapters to description of gender incongruence under its sexual health chapter. So this is what I was talking about. So it's no longer classified as a disorder, which was big news at the time. And it was moved to, so I say recent, but it's already a couple of years ago. And it was moved to a section under sexual health and referred to as gender incongruence, which is important because now not being referred to as a disorder hopefully should remove any stigma. The word disorder implies there's something wrong, there's something not correct, and yeah, that's not great. It just leads to what's the right word? It leads to that feeling of being, especially as a trans child, if there is something wrong with you. That's what it feels like, that the classification is enforcing that that there is something wrong, that you have a disorder. And yeah, that's difficult. And it also then affects how other people view it. People hear the word disorder and assume something wrong that needs to be corrected in terms of, well, it's an illness, right? So you need to try and get rid of those feelings, and that is known as conversion therapy. So yeah, I think that's a good change. WHO officials said at the time that this change was made to reduce stigma. The Human Rights Watch said the government should move swiftly to reform laws that require this now officially outdated diagnosis. So that was back in 2019, and still nothing done here. But Brady's view, as per meeting documents submitted to the court, was that it didn't matter where the diagnosis was categorised, whether under mental health or sexual health. It remained a diagnosis, but was not perpetuating a mental health stigma. So it's only my personal view, but I disagree with that. So as someone who grew up hearing the word disorder, it makes you feel like there is something wrong with you, and that's not a nice feeling. There's something wrong with you that needs to be fixed. You're other, you're not right. And yeah, outside the medical context, that's the implication it can have. And so for people who aren't, this isn't an important issue to them, and they hear about a disorder, you implicate, there's something wrong with them, or they're ill. To me, that is a stigma, and it can lead to people being treated in a certain way because they're believed to be ill. And if we can get away from that, that's ideal. Does that rhyme? Idea. According to the meeting notes involving Dr. Brady, the National Advisor on LGBT Health did not appear keen on assessing psychological readiness or fitness to proceed, the additions of which he considered would further medicalise the process and more intrinsically link gender recognition to medical treatment. Ultimately, Brady recommended using the terminology that is used in the medical community, and that is gender dysphoria. However, it is also recorded that he wondered how the LGBT sector would receive this, though there would also be kickback from clinicians. Okay. Right. So what were the view of clinicians? I mean, we can look at it, right? So, MA, self-identity. So, following a wide-ranging debate at the BMA's annual representative meeting, doctors backed the right of transgender and non-binary people to self-identify, said that under 18 should be allowed access to healthcare, and that trans people should be able to receive healthcare in settings appropriate to their gender. Doctors also agreed that trans healthcare workers should be able to access facilities appropriate to the gender they identify as, and that trans people should be able to access gendered space in line with the gender they identify as. The debate is heard from doctors with strongly differing views. At one point, Representative Body Chair Hannah McKeown said the tension in the room was palpable, but in the end the meeting sent a clear message that the BMA supports trans rights. So... Okay, so that's supporting self-ID. So this is the BMA coming out in support of self-ID, literally, I think, days before the consultation results were announced last September. So, this thing of confusion by removing it from the where's that come from? where's the evidence? Let's see the evidence on that, because there isn't any at the moment. And if that's a single thing that stopped it being removed, that needs to be investigated. Liz Truss originally planned full reform, including a Gender Recognition Act reform bill. Liz Truss had been planning on reforming the Gender Recognition Act and scrapping the gender dysphoria diagnosis requirement since at least 3rd of March 2020. At this time, GRA officials had prepared a draft statement for Truss on the government's response to the Gender Recognition Act consultation on the basis of Option A GRA reform bill accompanied by non-legislative reforms, given your previous steers on this issue. It is clear from the content of the submission that Liz Truss had discussed the issue generally with Number 10. Mr. Justice Schofield said in the High Court Judicial Review's judgment. The then current lead option was to take forward reforms to the 2004 Act, accompanied by some wider non-legislative reforms. The GRA officials understood that one of the key legislative reforms that both the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister's office wanted to include in the bill related to the need for medical reports and the required diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Okay, so they were also considering removal of medical reports. Both Truss and Johnson were keen to move away from the diagnosis of gender dysphoria required by the current legislation, while retaining the need for trans people to provide some supporting medical evidence in their application for legal gender recognition as an important safeguard that would deter vexatious applications. Okay, so one, that's still not needed. We don't. Why? What safeguards this? What is this actually safeguarding? Especially as someone can just submit through their GP stuff they are planning to do. So it's not safeguarding anything. It's just for people who are genuinely transitioning, or are trans and aren't transitioning, and so therefore aren't necessarily going under any medical intervention. It is clear that there was an eagerness to move away from a diagnosis of gender dysphoria being required. On the 29th of May 2020, GEO officials wrote to Truss letting her know that they'd encountered some difficulties in their communications with the Department of Health and Social Care around removing the requirement for a gender dysphoria diagnosis. Specifically, Dr. Brady had said it would be impractical. Again, why? Why would it be impractical? After this, Truss' previous enthusiasm for removal of the requirement for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria hung in the balance, the High Court said, in light of the concerns expressed by the government's National Advisor on LGBT Health. As of June 22nd, Truss had changed her mind. She now wanted to amend the existing legislation to remove reference to the diagnosis of gender dysphoria and replace it with a diagnosis of gender incongruence. I mean, okay, that's cool, keeping it up to date, but you're still then requiring a diagnosis, so that's nowhere near as an impactful change. The final draft government response to the consultation, which was attached to the 22nd June 2020 submission, now, again, proposed removal of the requirement for applicants to provide a diagnosis of gender dysphoria and replacing it with gender incongruence, the document says. GEO's position was that reform should still be taken forward. But by the 2nd of July, Truss and Johnson had agreed to keep the current legislation as it stands and make an oral statement about Gender Recognition Act reform, scrapping their original plan from just months before to publish a GRA reform bill. In September 2020, Truss announced that she wouldn't reform the Gender Recognition Act. Instead, the process of legal gender recognition would be moved online and the application fee reduced. LGBT plus groups condemned her decision as a shocking failure of leadership by not bringing about more meaningful reforms for trans people. Last month, the fee was reduced from £140 to £5. A Government Equality Hub spokesman said, the current legislative system allows for people to change their legal sex in a safe and fair way. Following the consultation on the Gender Recognition Act, we are delivering on our promise to modernise... Okay, so this is just stuff from before. So I've gone over in a previous video this stuff, so feel free to check that out. It's highly intrusive. It's not fair. It's expensive, and unnecessary. When you get down to it. But yeah, please feel free to watch my other video on that part of it. In terms of this, this is so upsetting at the same time as sort of relieved that the government actually was in favour of some significant change based on the back to the consultation. But the fact they were so close and it didn't go through because Dr. Brady said it would be impractical without any actual justification for why, other than it would be confusing for then when someone goes for the medical treatment, that then they would still apply a diagnosis of gender incongruence or dysphoria. But that's a separate thing. Getting legal gender recognition is separate to medically transitioning. I mean, that's especially significant for non-binary people, right? Okay. So, I guess you could look at this in two ways. As a little bit of good news, and actually it wasn't just out of hand, no, we're not doing anything based off the consultation. That's good. It's increased my respect a little bit for the government. But it does sadden me that the reasons for then why that was then scrapped, this Gender Recognition Act bill, seem to be very vague. Or at least based upon the fact of needing to retain some sort of medical reports. It feels like because they weren't willing to remove the medical reports, that then because they would then be diagnosing with this gender dysphoria anyway, it didn't make sense. So it's like both or neither. But then the answer there, from my very biased view, would be to get rid of the reports. Why are they necessary? Why do you have to prove your identity? Again, the BMA are not in favour of this. Okay, so if I think to sum that up, a little bit of good news, but yeah, maybe let's leave this on. It wasn't as bad as we thought behind the scenes, I think, is a good summary of that. But the outcome was what it was. So the small glimmer of hope I see here is the fact that this now has been released. You can now have proper scrutiny on the reasons why that was seen as impractical, if that was the sticking point. So that allows now the discussion to move forwards. Whereas before it was just proper checks and balances in place and there was no actual discussion, which was the most infuriating thing. So, and this is their job, right? The consultation was in support of these reforms. Yes, things might be complicated or difficult, but that's their job to work out how best then to apply them, or apply those results of the consultation. But let's hope. Let's see what comes out of this. Let's see what scrutiny into the reasons why it was deemed impractical leads to. Maybe something will come out of this. Let's hope it does. Let's hope maybe we can revive that bill in some form. Hey, ideally it could have been more, right? Ideally just get rid of, the spousal consent and all of the medical reports. But I wouldn't have been upset at the removal of the diagnosis for gender dysphoria. That would have been a good step forward. So, sometimes progress just comes in small steps, and that would have been a good push forwards. And I say small steps. You could argue just reducing the fee and moving online is a step. Technically, it's a step of some kind, but it's not in terms of making it fairer or kinder to people. It's a step in making it more accessible, but that's it. Cool. Well, thank you. I hope you have enjoyed watching. If you have any questions, please feel free. You can always join me whilst I'm streaming and ask any questions you might have. Again, I currently am trying to raise money for Mermaids, a charity in the UK. They support young, trans and gender diverse children. Please, if you have any money spare, please donate if you can. If you can't, no worries. Just if you could share my videos around, that would be very much appreciated. You're very welcome. Like, this is the stuff that's so important, right? And I hope you've enjoyed. I don't know how long you've been watching, but I hope you've enjoyed some of my rambling. I know I can go a bit, all over the place sometimes. I go off on one point and then come back about 20 minutes later. But I hope it's of some interest. The whole point of this channel is to try and encourage more constructive conversation, and try and pick out some of the positives, but equally, highlight the bad stuff when it does happen. But equally, I don't want to just be, oh, this is bad, like the stuff I was going over earlier with the the EHRC stepping into the Maya Force Data Tribunal. What's it called? Brain fails. What just happened? Not the trial, the subsequent sort of challenge. Appeal is the word I'm looking for. It's, you could easily look at that as, oh my god, they're trying to propagate anti-trans rhetoric, and that's going to propagate then into people proud to misgender people in the workplace, in other places, and that could mean that would be horrible, right? I'm trans, and that's scary. The thought that someone could then misgender me purposely and then have the protection of law under the Equalities Act saying that they're entitled to do that. That's terrifying. However, when you dig a bit more into some of these things, as always, it's not so black and white. There's a bit of nuance to it, and what they're actually trying to defend is the freedom of belief, which I think we all should be in favour for. And anyone should be able to believe whatever they want. It's how that manifests, and that's so key. If you manifest your beliefs in a constructive, respectful way, then you can move forward. You can have these good discussions with people. If instead they betray some bigotry and because you start being disrespectful, well, that's where you're then impinging on other people's rights, and that's where, that should not be protected. I hope you found it interesting. I was originally going to come back later to play some Resident Evil Village. I don't know if you are interested in that, but it is currently 9:10 here and I haven't had dinner yet. I went on rambling somewhat longer than I was expecting, but I may still come back in a couple of hours or so. So if you're interested in watching me get eaten by zombie-like creatures, then feel free to join me then. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed and have a good evening.